The landscape of Zalaria stretched out in a grim expanse of dust and ruin. Once a verdant haven teeming with life, it was now a desolate wasteland, the scars of the galactic war etched deep into its surface. Anara, a lone Xylari scout, navigated the barren terrain with a heavy heart, the weight of her people's downfall pressing down on her shoulders. Her mission was to find any remaining survivors, but after countless days of fruitless searching, her hope was wearing thin. Her keen eyes, trained to notice the slightest anomaly, caught a glint of metal on the horizon. Squinting against the harsh sunlight, she saw a wrecked spacecraft partially buried in the sand. It wasn't Xylari design. Cautiously, she approached the crash site, her blaster at the ready. The ship's hull was scorched and twisted, evidence of a violent descent. The hatch was ajar, hanging loosely on its hinges. Peering inside, Anara's heart skipped a beat. Amidst the wreckage lay a human soldier, unconscious and gravely injured. His uniform was torn and bloodied, his breathing shallow. She had been taught to see humans as the enemy, the invaders who had brought devastation to her world. Yet seeing this man so vulnerable, a pang of empathy pierced her hardened heart. Anara hesitated, her instincts warring with her compassion. Leaving him to die would be easy, but something in his face, despite its alien features, stirred a long-buried sense of mercy within her. She made a decision that would change her life forever. Slinging her blaster over her shoulder, she carefully dragged the soldier out of the wreck and to a nearby cave, a shelter she had found earlier. As she tended to his wounds, using her limited medical supplies, Anara couldn't help but marvel at the human's resilience. His injuries were severe, yet he clung to life with a tenacity that both impressed and puzzled her. She worked through the night, her hands steady despite her fatigue. By dawn, she had done all she could. Now it was up to him to survive. The following day, the human soldier stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes filled with confusion and pain. Anara watched from a distance, her blaster within reach. He tried to sit up, wincing in agony. His gaze locked onto her, a mixture of fear and curiosity in his eyes. "Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You're on Xylaria," Anara replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I found you near your crashed ship. You're lucky to be alive." The soldier's brow furrowed as he struggled to piece together his memories. "Xylaria, my ship was shot down. I must be behind enemy lines." Anara nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "You are, but for now, you're safe." He looked at her, suspicion mingling with gratitude. "Why did you help me?" Anara hesitated, searching for an answer that made sense. Maybe I'm just tired of all the killing." An uneasy silence settled between them. Despite the enmity between their races, they both understood that survival required cooperation. The human, who introduced himself as Captain Mark Rains, slowly regained his strength under Anara's watchful care. His training as a soldier became evident as he offered to help fortify their shelter and scavenge for supplies, proving his usefulness. Days turned into weeks, and a fragile alliance began to form. Mark's military experience complemented Anara's knowledge of the terrain. They worked together to find food and water, avoiding hostile patrols and the dangers that lurked in the desolate landscape. Anara found herself softening towards the human, his resilience and determination mirroring her own. One evening, as they rested by a small fire, Mark shared stories of Earth. He spoke of vast oceans, bustling cities, and green forests, painting a picture of a world that seemed almost mythical to Anara. She listened intently, captivated by his descriptions of a place so different from the wasteland that Xylaria had become. "Do you miss it?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Mark nodded, a wistful look in his eyes. "Every day, but right now, surviving here with you is all that matters." Anara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in a long time. The human soldier was no longer just an enemy. He was a companion, someone who understood the pain of loss and the struggle to survive. Their conversations grew more personal, the walls between them slowly crumbling as they shared their fears, hopes, and dreams. Their bond was put to the test when they were ambushed by a group of rogue Xylari scavengers. Driven mad by the war and their own desperation, the scavengers attacked without warning. Anara and Mark fought side by side, their movements synchronized in a deadly dance of survival. Blaster fire lit up the night, the air thick with the sounds of battle. Anara's heart pounded as she watched Mark take down one attacker after another with precision and skill. But just as they thought they had the upper hand, a scavenger landed a brutal blow on Mark, sending him crashing to the ground. "No!" Anara screamed, her voice filled with a raw anguish she hadn't felt in years. Fueled by a fierce protectiveness, she unleashed a torrent of fire, taking down the remaining scavengers with a ferocity that surprised even herself. Panting and covered in sweat, she rushed to Mark's side. He was alive but barely conscious, his face contorted in pain. Anara cradled his head in her lap, her heart aching at the sight of his suffering. "Stay with me, Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't lose you now." The realization hit her like a tidal wave. This human, this enemy, had become someone she cared about deeply. Their bond had transcended the animosity between their species, forging a connection that neither had anticipated. As she tended to his wounds once more, Anara felt a renewed sense of determination. They would survive this together, no matter the odds. The desolate landscape of Zalaria had brought them together, and against all logic and reason, they had found solace in each other. The journey ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer just a Zalari scout and a human soldier. They were allies, friends, and perhaps something more. With Mark's life hanging in the balance, Anara vowed to protect him with everything she had. The desolate encounter that had brought them together was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge their beliefs, test their limits, and ultimately redefine what it meant to be enemies in a galaxy torn apart by war. The days following the ambush were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Mark's condition remained critical, and Anara found herself caring for him with an intensity that surprised her. She scouted for supplies, hunted for food, and tended to his injuries, her worry growing with each passing hour. The barren landscape of Xylaria was unforgiving, and the looming threat of more scavenger attacks kept her on constant alert. Mark drifted in and out of consciousness, his feverish mutterings revealing fragments of his past. He spoke of Earth, of battles fought and comrades lost. Anara listened, her heart aching with empathy. She could see the parallels between his experiences and her own, the grief, the anger, the relentless fight for survival. Despite their differences, they were united by the scars of war. One morning, as the sun cast its pale light over the desolate horizon, Mark awoke with a clarity that had been absent for days. His eyes, though weary, held a spark of determination. Anara was by his side, her expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Mark took a deep breath, wincing slightly. "Better, thanks to you. I owe you my life." Anara shook her head. "We owe each other. Out here, we have to look out for one another." Their alliance, born out of necessity, began to solidify. Mark, though still weak, insisted on helping with their daily tasks. He repaired their shelter, using whatever scraps and materials he could find, and taught Anara some basic survival techniques he had learned during his military training. In return, she shared her knowledge of the land, teaching him how to identify edible plants and navigate the treacherous terrain. Their cooperation extended beyond mere survival. They began to talk, tentatively at first, then with growing openness. Mark spoke of his home, of the vibrant cities and vast wildernesses of Earth. Anara described the beauty that Xylaria once held, before the war turned it into a wasteland. Their stories, though filled with pain, also carried a glimmer of hope, a reminder of what they were fighting for. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mark turned to Anara with a thoughtful expression. "Tell me about your people. What were they like before all this?" Anara stared into the flames, her eyes reflecting their flickering light. "We were a peaceful race once. Our society was built on harmony with nature and each other. The war changed everything. We were forced to become warriors, to fight for our survival." Mark nodded, his gaze unwavering. "War has a way of changing people, but it doesn't define us, not completely." Anara met his eyes, feeling a connection that transcended their differences. "You're right. We have to remember who we are and what we're fighting for." Their conversations grew deeper, their bond stronger. The barriers that once divided them began to crumble, replaced by a mutual respect and understanding. They learned to trust each other, to rely on each other's strengths. Mark's resilience and tactical mind complemented Anara's knowledge and resourcefulness. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Their newfound alliance was put to the test when a group of enemy patrols discovered their location. Anara and Mark had been scouting for supplies when they spotted the patrols approaching. They barely had time to hide before the soldiers were upon them. Mark's heart raced as he watched the heavily armed patrols search the area, their expressions grim and determined. "We need to move," Anara whispered, her eyes scanning the terrain for a possible escape route. Mark nodded, his mind racing. "Agreed, but we can't lead them back to our shelter. We'll have to create a diversion." Using their combined skills, they devised a plan. Anara set up a series of traps and distractions, drawing the patrols away from their true location. Mark, despite his weakened state, provided cover fire, his shots precise and calculated. The plan worked. The patrols were led astray, allowing Anara and Mark to slip away unnoticed. Once they were safe, Anara turned to Mark, her eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. "You saved us! I couldn't have done it without you." Mark shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "We did it together. We're a team now." As they made their way back to their shelter, the weight of their shared experiences hung between them. The danger they faced was far from over, but their bond gave them strength. They had become more than just allies. They were partners, united by their will to survive and their growing trust in one another. That night, as they sat by the fire, the stars shining brightly above them, Anara felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The human soldier beside her was no longer just an enemy. He was a friend, perhaps even more. And in this harsh, unforgiving world, that made all the difference. The weeks rolled on, marked by the rhythm of survival and the ever-present need to remain vigilant. Anara and Mark had settled into a routine, a delicate balance of labor and watchfulness that allowed them to eke out an existence in the hostile environment of Xylaria. Each day brought new challenges, yet their growing bond provided a foundation of strength and resilience. One crisp morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Mark awoke to find Anara already up, scanning the landscape from their elevated shelter. She had crafted a small lookout post among the remnants of a long-abandoned watchtower, and it had become her habit to survey the area at dawn and dusk. Mark approached her quietly, his steps softened by the loose sand and rock. "Anything out there?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Anara shook her head, her eyes never leaving the horizon. "No signs of movement. We might have a quiet day for once." Mark chuckled softly. That would be a welcome change. He joined her at the lookout, the two of them standing side by side, their shoulders almost touching. The silence between them was comfortable, a testament to the trust that had blossomed through shared trials and mutual respect. Their moments of quiet reflection were often brief, interrupted by the harsh demands of their surroundings. That day, however, proved to be an exception. As the hours passed without incident, Anara and Mark took advantage of the lull to work on fortifying their shelter and replenishing their supplies. They moved with an ease born of familiarity, their tasks synchronized through silent communication. As they gathered firewood, Anara glanced at Mark, her expression thoughtful. "Tell me more about your family," she said. "You mentioned your sister once. What's she like?" Mark's face softened at the mention of his sister. "Sarah's the best. She's strong-willed, smarter than I am, and she has this incredible ability to make everyone around her feel at ease. Before I left for the war, she was studying to become a doctor. She always wanted to help people." Anara smiled, picturing the young woman through Mark's words. "She sounds remarkable. Do you think you'll see her again?" Mark's smile faltered, a shadow crossing his features. "I hope so. But with the way things are, I just don't know." Anara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll find a way, Mark. We have to believe that." Their bond had deepened into something more profound than either had anticipated. They shared not only their stories and dreams, but also their fears and vulnerabilities. Anara found herself relying on Mark's steady presence, drawing strength from his unwavering determination. In turn, Mark took solace in Anara's wisdom and her unyielding spirit. Their partnership was tested once more when a sudden storm swept across the landscape, bringing with it a torrent of wind and rain. Their shelter, though sturdy, was not immune to the onslaught. As the storm raged outside, they worked tirelessly to reinforce their defenses, using every available resource to keep the elements at bay. In the midst of the chaos, a section of their shelter's roof gave way, sending a cascade of water pouring in. Anara and Mark scrambled to contain the breach, their movements frantic but coordinated. As they worked, the storm's fury seemed to echo their own desperation, a reminder of the precariousness of their situation. When the storm finally abated, they were left exhausted but triumphant. The shelter, though battered, had held. They collapsed onto the dry ground, their breath coming in ragged gasps. "That was intense," Mark said, wiping rainwater from his face. Anara nodded, her eyes closed as she caught her breath. "It was, but we made it through, together." As they lay there, the afterglow of their victory mingling with their fatigue, Anara felt a warmth spreading through her chest. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to experience in a long time: hope. Mark had become more than a comrade in arms. He was a beacon of light in the darkness that surrounded them. Their bond was further solidified the next day when they discovered a hidden cache of supplies buried beneath the ruins of an old building. Among the items were medical kits, food rations, and a small battered radio. The discovery was a windfall, offering not only the means to survive, but also a chance to communicate with the outside world. Mark inspected the radio, his expression hopeful. "If we can get this working, we might be able to contact friendly forces. We could get off this planet, Anara." The prospect of leaving Xylaria was both thrilling and daunting. Anara had spent so long in the desolate landscape that the idea of returning to a world beyond its borders seemed almost surreal. Yet the thought of reuniting with their respective families and finding peace spurred her on. Together, they worked on the radio, their efforts fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. As the days turned into weeks, their progress was slow but steady. They scavenged for parts, repaired damaged components, and painstakingly fine-tuned the device. Each small victory brought them closer to their goal, and with it, the promise of a brighter future. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the stars twinkling overhead, Mark turned to Anara with a thoughtful expression. "What will you do once we're off this planet? Where will you go?" Anara considered the question, her gaze distant. "I want to find my people, those who survived. I want to help rebuild what we lost and create a future where we can live in peace." Mark nodded, his eyes reflecting the same determination. "And I want to see my family again to help rebuild our world too. Maybe one day our worlds can coexist without fear or hatred." Anara smiled, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and affection. "I believe that day will come, Mark, and until then we'll face whatever challenges come our way. Together." Their bond, forged in the crucible of survival and tempered by mutual respect and trust, had become unbreakable. As they faced the uncertain days ahead, they did so with the knowledge that they were no longer alone. In each other, they had found a partner, a friend, and perhaps something more. And in the desolate expanse of Xylaria, that made all the difference. The steady routine Anara and Mark had established was shattered one fateful afternoon. The air was unusually still, and an eerie silence hung over the barren landscape. Anara felt a prickling at the back of her neck, a sense of impending danger that set her on edge. She and Mark were on a supply run, moving carefully through the ruins of an old Xylari settlement, their senses sharp and alert. They had just turned a corner when they were ambushed by a group of rogue Xylari scavengers. These scavengers, driven to madness by the war and the desolation of their world, had become ruthless and unpredictable. Their eyes gleamed with a wild, feral hunger as they descended upon Anara and Mark with makeshift weapons and an alarming ferocity. Reacting instinctively, Anara and Mark fought back. Anara's blaster fired rapidly, her shots precise and lethal. Mark, despite his lingering injuries, moved with the fluidity of a seasoned warrior, his own blaster sending bolts of energy towards their attackers. The narrow alley became a battleground, the sounds of blaster fire and shouted commands echoing off the crumbling walls. Anara's heart pounded in her chest as she dodged an incoming blow, her mind racing to keep up with the chaotic scene unfolding around her. She glanced at Mark, his face a mask of concentration, and felt a surge of determination. They had faced danger together before, and they would overcome this threat as well. The scavengers were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Anara and Mark found themselves pushed back, their retreat hampered by the debris and narrow confines of the alley. Anara felt a sharp pain as a scavenger's weapon grazed her arm, but she pushed the pain aside, focusing on their immediate survival. "Mark, we need to fall back!" she shouted over the din of battle, her voice urgent. Mark nodded, his eyes flicking to an old building that offered potential cover. "This way!" he called, covering their retreat with a barrage of blaster fire. They moved as one, their steps synchronized by necessity. Reaching the building, they ducked inside, barricading the entrance with whatever they could find. The scavengers pounded on the doors, their snarls and curses filling the air, but for the moment, Anara and Mark had a brief respite. Anara leaned against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't stay here long. They'll break through eventually." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "We need a plan. We can't take them all head-on." Scanning their surroundings, Anara's eyes fell on an old ventilation shaft. "There," she said, pointing. "We can use the shaft to get to the roof. From there, we might be able to pick them off or find another escape route." Mark agreed, and they quickly made their way to the shaft, the sounds of the scavengers' assault growing louder. Climbing up, they emerged onto the roof, the open sky a stark contrast to the confined chaos below. From their vantage point, they could see the scavengers milling around, trying to find a way in. "Here," Anara said, handing Mark a small pouch of explosive charges. "We can use these to create a distraction." Mark took the charges, his eyes meeting hers with a look of determination. "Let's do this." Working quickly, they set the charges in strategic locations, ensuring maximum impact. Once everything was in place, they took cover behind a low wall, their fingers on the detonators. "Ready?" Mark asked, his voice steady despite the tension. Anara nodded, her grip firm. "Ready?" With a simultaneous click, the charges exploded, sending shockwaves through the settlement. The scavengers were thrown into disarray, their ranks broken by the sudden blasts. Taking advantage of the confusion, Anara and Mark opened fire from their rooftop position, their shots picking off the scattered enemies with ruthless efficiency. The tide of the battle turned in their favor, the remaining scavengers fleeing in terror. Anara and Mark didn't relent until they were sure the threat was neutralized. As the dust settled, they surveyed the aftermath, their breaths heavy but their spirits unbroken. Mark turned to Anara, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it." Anara nodded, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline. "We make a good team." The bond between them had been tested and had emerged stronger. The ambush had reminded them of the constant danger they faced, but it had also reinforced their trust and reliance on each other. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with, a partnership forged in the fires of survival. As they made their way back to their shelter, the sun dipping low on the horizon, Anara felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had survived another day, and with each challenge they overcame, their hope for a future beyond the desolation grew brighter. In Mark, she had found not only an ally, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood her struggles and shared her determination to rebuild. That night, as they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces, Anara felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still fraught with danger, but with Mark by her side, she knew they could face whatever came their way. Together, they would find a way to not just survive, but to thrive in a world that had once seemed devoid of hope. The days following the ambush were filled with an air of cautious optimism. Anara and Mark had managed to survive a significant threat, and their bond had only grown stronger because of it. They worked together more seamlessly than ever, their movements and decisions reflecting an unspoken understanding. Their shared goal of survival and the prospect of a future beyond the desolation drove them forward. One morning, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Anara and Mark set out to explore an area they hadn't yet investigated. The coordinates had been stored in an old Xylari data pad Anara had found during one of their scavenging missions. The pad indicated the possible location of a hidden Xylari resistance base in the northern mountains. It was a long shot, but the potential for finding allies or additional resources was worth the risk. The journey was arduous. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they moved north, the once flat expanse giving way to rocky outcrops and steep inclines. Anara led the way, her knowledge of the landscape guiding them through the most treacherous paths. Mark followed closely, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any signs of danger. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. Their breaths came in visible puffs, and they pulled their cloaks tighter against the chill. Despite the physical exertion, their spirits remained high. The possibility of finding a resistance base filled them with a sense of purpose and hope. After hours of grueling ascent, they finally reached a plateau that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the jagged peaks. Anara paused, her eyes scanning the landscape for any signs of the base. "There," she said, pointing to a cluster of rocks that seemed out of place. "Do you see it? That formation. It looks artificial." Mark squinted, following her gaze. "You're right. Let's check it out." They approached cautiously, their weapons at the ready. As they drew closer, it became clear that the rock formation was indeed hiding an entrance. Anara found a concealed panel and, using her knowledge of Xylari technology, activated the hidden mechanism. The rocks shifted aside, revealing a narrow passageway leading into the mountain. With a mixture of anticipation and caution, they entered the passage. The air inside was cool and damp, and the walls were lined with old, dormant machinery. They moved quietly, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space. After a short walk, the passage opened into a large underground chamber. The chamber was filled with the remnants of a once active base. There were storage crates, communication consoles, and a variety of equipment, all covered in a fine layer of dust. Anara and Mark exchanged a look of excitement and relief. "This could be it," Mark said, his voice filled with hope. "We might have found the resistance base." Anara nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "Let's see what we can find. There might be supplies or even a way to contact the outside world." They split up, each taking a different section of the chamber. Anara headed towards the communication consoles, brushing off the dust and examining the equipment. Mark went through the storage crates, searching for anything useful. As they worked, the sense of hope that had brought them here began to grow. After some time, Anara managed to power up one of the consoles. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of old messages and data logs. She sifted through them, searching for anything that could help their cause. One message in particular caught her attention. It was a distress signal sent from another Xylari base not far from their current location. "Mark, come look at this," she called, her voice tinged with excitement. Mark joined her, his eyes widening as he read the message. "A distress signal? That means there might be other survivors nearby." Anara nodded. "We need to find them. They could be our allies, and together we might have a better chance of rebuilding." Their decision was unanimous. They would follow the signal and search for the survivors. Gathering what supplies they could from the base, they prepared for the next leg of their journey. The prospect of finding other Xylari filled Anara with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed less bleak. As they set out once more, their steps were lighter, their resolve stronger. They navigated the rugged terrain with determination, driven by the hope of finding allies and the promise of a better future. The journey was challenging, but the thought of reuniting with other Xylari and possibly even finding a way to end the war kept them going. After several days of travel, they arrived at the location indicated by the distress signal. It was a hidden valley, shielded by towering cliffs and dense foliage. Anara's heart raced with anticipation as they approached the entrance. They moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready, but the valley appeared deserted. "Do you think the signal was a trap?" Mark asked, his voice low. Anara shook her head. I don't think so. The message seemed genuine. Let's keep looking. They continued deeper into the valley, their eyes scanning for any signs of life. Finally, they found a small, concealed entrance to an underground bunker. The door was slightly ajar, and inside they could hear faint voices. Hello? Anara called out, her voice echoing in the confined space. We're here in response to your distress signal. We're allies. The voices fell silent for a moment, then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a Xylari woman, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and hope. You found us, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. We thought we were the last ones. Anara felt a surge of relief. You're not alone. We're here to help. The woman led them into the bunker where a small group of Xylari survivors huddled together. They looked worn and exhausted, but their eyes held a spark of hope. Anara and Mark introduced themselves, sharing their story and their plans for the future. The survivors listened intently, their expressions a mixture of awe and gratitude. We thought all was lost, one of them said, but now, with your help, we have a chance. That night, as they sat together sharing stories and plans, Anara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in a long time. They were no longer just two survivors in a desolate world. They were part of something bigger, a growing resistance that held the promise of a brighter future. As the stars shone brightly above the hidden valley, Anara and Mark knew they had found more than just allies. They had found hope, and in a world ravaged by war, that was the most powerful weapon they could wield. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by their shared goal and their unwavering bond. The discovery of the Xylari survivors marked a turning point for Anara and Mark. With newfound allies and a burgeoning sense of hope, they began the arduous task of rebuilding and fortifying the hidden valley. The survivors, though weary and traumatized, rallied under Anara and Mark's leadership, their determination fueled by the promise of a better future. The first priority was to secure the valley. Mark, with his military expertise, coordinated the construction of defensive structures and strategic lookout points. Anara used her knowledge of the land to help identify the best locations for fortifications and to find hidden resources within the valley. Together, they transformed the once desolate area into a secure stronghold. Days turned into weeks as they worked tirelessly. The survivors, inspired by Anara and Mark's unwavering resolve, put their skills to use, contributing to the effort with a renewed sense of purpose. Engineers repaired old machinery, farmers began to cultivate the fertile soil, and scouts were sent out to gather intelligence on enemy movements. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, casting a warm glow over the valley, Anara and Mark took a moment to survey their progress. They stood on a hill overlooking the bustling activity below, their hearts swelling with pride and hope. We've come a long way, Mark said, his voice filled with admiration. Look at what we've accomplished together. Anara nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. It's amazing what we can achieve when we work as one. This valley is becoming a sanctuary, a place where we can start anew. Their bond had deepened into something unspoken but undeniable. They were no longer just comrades. They were partners in every sense of the word. Their trust in each other had become the foundation upon which the entire community was built. As they watched the survivors work together, Anara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. She turned to Mark, her heart full of gratitude. Thank you, Mark, for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. Mark smiled, his eyes reflecting the same gratitude. And I couldn't have done it without you, Anara. We're a team, and together we're unstoppable. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of the scouts, a young Xylari named Kale. His expression was urgent, his breathing heavy from running. Anara, Mark, he said, catching his breath. We spotted an enemy patrol heading this way. They'll be here by dawn. The gravity of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had worked hard to build their sanctuary, but the threat of the enemy was never far behind. Anara and Mark exchanged a determined look. Let's gather everyone, Anara said, her voice steady. We need to prepare for their arrival. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. The survivors fortified the defenses, set up traps, and armed themselves with whatever weapons they could find. Anara and Mark moved among them, offering guidance and encouragement. Despite the imminent threat, there was a sense of unity and resolve that permeated the camp. As dawn approached, the tension in the valley was palpable. The survivors took their positions, ready to defend their home. Anara and Mark stood side by side at the front lines, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the approaching enemy patrol. They moved cautiously, their weapons at the ready. Anara raised her blaster, her eyes fixed on the advancing soldiers. "Hold your fire until they're within range," she instructed, her voice calm but firm. The moments stretched out, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the enemy was close enough. Anara gave the signal, and the valley erupted in a cacophony of blaster fire and shouted commands. The defensive traps were triggered, catching the enemy off guard and causing chaos in their ranks. Mark led a flanking maneuver, his tactical mind turning the tide of the battle. Anara fought with a fierce determination, her movements precise and lethal. The survivors, inspired by their leaders, fought bravely, their resolve unshaken. The battle was intense, but the enemy was no match for the united front presented by Anara, Mark, and the survivors. One by one, the enemy soldiers fell, their advance halted by the sheer force of the resistance. As the last of the enemy retreated, a cheer rose up from the defenders. "We did it!" Cale shouted, his voice filled with triumph. Anara lowered her blaster, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She turned to Mark, who was similarly spent, but smiling broadly. "We did," he agreed, his eyes shining with pride. The victory was more than just a successful defense. It was a testament to the strength and unity of their community. They had faced a formidable threat and emerged victorious, their bond stronger than ever. In the days that followed, the survivors celebrated their victory and continued to fortify their home. Anara and Mark took the time to reflect on their journey and the bond that had brought them to this point. They knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but they also knew that they could face anything as long as they were together. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the stars twinkling above them, Anara leaned against Mark, feeling the warmth of his presence. "We've come so far," she said softly, "and I know we'll go even further." Mark wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "As long as we're together, there's nothing we can't achieve." Their bond had become the cornerstone of their new beginning, a symbol of hope and resilience in a world that had tried to break them. With each passing day, they grew stronger, their love for each other a beacon of light in the darkness. As they faced the future, Anara and Mark knew that they were no longer just survivors. They were builders, dreamers, and warriors, united by a bond that transcended the boundaries of their worlds. Together, they would forge a new path, one filled with promise and possibility. And in the heart of their sanctuary, they had found not only a home, but a new beginning, one that they would face side by side. The peace Anara and Mark had fought so hard to establish was shattered one morning when a lookout burst into the main assembly hall with dire news. The enemy had discovered their sanctuary, and a massive force was advancing on the valley. The tension in the air was palpable as the survivors gathered to hear the report, their faces etched with worry. Anara and Mark stood at the front, their expressions calm but determined. They had known this day might come, and they were ready to defend their home. Mark addressed the crowd, his voice steady and filled with resolve. "We knew this day would come," he began, his gaze sweeping over the gathered survivors. "But we are ready. We have built this sanctuary together, and we will defend it together. We are stronger than they know, and we will show them that we will not be broken." Anara stepped forward, her eyes meeting those of the people she had come to consider family. "We've faced challenges before, and we've overcome them. Today we stand united. We fight not just for ourselves, but for the future we are building. Stay strong, stay focused, and remember what we are fighting for." The preparations were swift and efficient. The defensive structures were reinforced, weapons were distributed, and everyone took their positions. Anara and Mark moved among the defenders, offering words of encouragement and final instructions. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of fear and determination, the gravity of the situation clear to all. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the enemy force came into view. It was larger than any they had faced before, a formidable army equipped with advanced weaponry and armored vehicles. Anara felt a chill run down her spine, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. Mark turned to her, his expression serious. "Are you ready?" Anara nodded, her grip tightening on her blaster. "Ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this." The first wave of enemy soldiers approached the valley's entrance, and the defenders held their breath. At Anara's signal, they unleashed a barrage of fire, the sounds of blasters and explosions filling the air. The traps they had set were triggered, causing confusion and chaos in the enemy ranks. Mark led a contingent of fighters in a flanking maneuver, using the terrain to their advantage. Anara coordinated the defense from the central command post, her eyes darting between the battle and the communication console. The enemy was relentless, but the defenders held their ground, their resolve unyielding. The battle raged on, the valley becoming a war zone. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. Anara fought alongside her people, her blaster firing with precision. She saw Mark in the thick of the fight, his leadership and courage inspiring those around him. As the day wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. The enemy, though numerous, was not prepared for the tenacity and ingenuity of the defenders. Anara and Mark's strategy of using the terrain and their defensive structures to their advantage paid off. The enemy's advance slowed, their forces thinning under the relentless pressure, but the battle was far from over. In a desperate bid to break the defenders' resolve, the enemy brought forward a massive assault vehicle, its cannons aimed directly at the valley's central command post. Anara's heart skipped a beat as she realized the danger. "We need to take out that vehicle," she said urgently to Mark over the comms. "It's going to tear through our defenses." Mark responded immediately. "I have an idea. Cover me." Anara watched as Mark and a small team moved swiftly towards the enemy's position, using the cover of the rocks and debris. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and admiration for his bravery. She provided covering fire, her shots precise and deadly. Mark and his team reached the vehicle, and with a combination of explosives and sheer determination, they managed to disable it. The explosion was deafening, a plume of smoke rising into the sky. The enemy's assault faltered, their morale shattered by the loss of their key weapon. Seizing the opportunity, Anara rallied the defenders for a final push. They charged forward, their battle cries echoing through the valley. The enemy, demoralized and disorganized, began to retreat. Anara and Mark fought side by side, their movements synchronized in a deadly dance of survival. As the last of the enemy soldiers fled, a cheer rose up from the defenders. They had done it. They had defended their home against overwhelming odds. Anara lowered her blaster, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She turned to Mark, who was similarly spent, but smiling broadly. "We did it," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Mark nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "We did. Together." The aftermath of the battle was a mixture of celebration and somber reflection. The defenders mourned their fallen comrades, but they also celebrated their hard-won victory. The valley, though scarred by the battle, remained their sanctuary. Anara and Mark stood together on the hill overlooking the valley, their hands intertwined. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the landscape. They had faced their greatest challenge and emerged victorious. Their bond, forged in the fires of war, had proven unbreakable. "We've come so far," Anara said softly, her eyes on the horizon. "And we have so much more to do." Mark squeezed her hand, his gaze filled with determination. "As long as we're together, we can face anything." Their victory was more than just a successful defense. It was a testament to the strength and unity of their community. They had proven that even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope and determination could prevail. As they looked out over the valley, they knew that their fight was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they had found a new beginning, a future filled with promise and possibility. And as long as they had each other, they knew they could build a world worth fighting for. The aftermath of the battle left the valley in a mix of triumph and sorrow. The survivors had defended their home, but the cost was high. The bodies of fallen comrades were laid to rest, and their loss weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. Despite the grief, there was a palpable sense of achievement. They had won a significant victory against the enemy, proving their strength and unity. Anara and Mark spent the days following the battle helping with the recovery efforts. They worked tirelessly, side by side, repairing defenses, tending to the wounded, and comforting those who had lost loved ones. Their presence provided a sense of stability and hope to the community. The bond between them had deepened through their shared experiences, and they found solace in each other's company. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Anara and Mark took a moment to rest by the fire. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and the stars began to twinkle in the growing darkness. Anara leaned against Mark, feeling the warmth of his presence. "We've come so far," Anara said softly, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "But I can't help but think about what's next." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that too. We've built something incredible here, but the war isn't over. There are still others out there who need our help." Anara turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Do you think we should leave the valley? Try to find more survivors and bring them here?" Mark took a deep breath, considering her words. "It's a risk, but I think it's worth it. We've shown that we can defend ourselves, and we've created a sanctuary. If we can find more allies, we could strengthen our position even further." Their conversation was interrupted by a crackle from the old radio they had repaired. It was a message from a distant Xylari outpost, one they hadn't heard from in months. Anara and Mark rushed to the console, their hearts pounding with anticipation. "This is Outpost Theta. We've managed to hold our position, but we're running low on supplies and manpower. If anyone is out there, we need help." Anara's eyes widened with urgency. "Mark, we have to help them. They're our people." Mark nodded, determination etched on his face. "We'll gather a team and set out at first light. We can't leave them to fend for themselves." The next morning, Anara and Mark assembled a group of their best fighters and set out towards Outpost Theta. The journey was arduous, the terrain treacherous, and the threat of enemy patrols ever present. But their resolve was unyielding. They knew the importance of their mission, and they were determined to succeed. Days turned into weeks as they traversed the rugged landscape. The further they traveled, the more signs of the war's devastation they encountered. Burnt-out villages, crumbling infrastructure, and the skeletal remains of fallen soldiers served as stark reminders of the conflict's toll. Finally, they reached Outpost Theta. The sight that greeted them was one of desperation. The outpost was under siege, its defenders barely holding off waves of enemy attacks. Without hesitation, Anara and Mark led their team into the fray, their arrival providing a much-needed boost to the beleaguered defenders. The battle was fierce, but the combined forces of Anara's team and the outpost's defenders managed to turn the tide. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden reinforcement, began to retreat. The cheers of victory were short-lived, however, as the reality of their situation set in. The outpost was severely damaged, and their supplies were nearly depleted. Anara and Mark quickly took charge, organizing the survivors and coordinating efforts to fortify the outpost. They worked tirelessly, their determination inspiring those around them. As the days passed, the outpost began to recover, and the morale of its defenders improved. One evening, as the sun set over the battered landscape, Anara and Mark stood together on the outpost's walls, looking out at the horizon. The bond between them had only grown stronger, and they found comfort in each other's presence. "We did it," Anara said, her voice filled with quiet pride. "We saved them." Mark nodded, his expression resolute. "And we'll keep saving as many as we can. This war has taken so much from us, but it won't take our spirit or our hope." Their mission to rescue the outpost had been a success, but it was clear that their fight was far from over. The enemy was still a formidable force, and the road to peace would be long and fraught with challenges. But Anara and Mark were ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they prepared to return to the valley with the survivors from Outpost Theta, Anara felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had proven that they could make a difference, that their efforts could turn the tide of the war, and with Mark by her side, she knew they could accomplish anything. Together, they led the convoy back to the valley. their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had saved more lives and strengthened their community. The valley, once a desolate refuge, had become a beacon of hope and resilience. Anara and Mark knew that they had found something truly special in each other, a partnership that transcended the boundaries of their worlds and a love that gave them the strength to keep fighting. As they arrived back at the valley, greeted by the cheers and warm embraces of their friends, Anara and Mark shared a quiet moment of reflection. They had come so far, and they had so much further to go. But with each step, they were forging a path towards a brighter future. Their journey was far from over, but they faced it with unwavering determination and a bond that could not be broken. Together, they would continue to fight, to rebuild, and to create a world where hope could flourish once more. And in each other, they had found the strength to endure, to persevere, and to triumph against all odds. The return journey to the valley was a triumphant one, with the survivors from Outpost Theta in tow. As Anara and Mark led the convoy, their hearts swelled with a sense of accomplishment and hope. The valley, now bustling with activity, had become a symbol of resilience and unity in the face of overwhelming adversity. Upon their arrival, the inhabitants of the valley greeted them with cheers and open arms. The survivors from Outpost Theta were welcomed as family, and the sense of community grew even stronger. Anara and Mark stood together, watching as people mingled, exchanged stories, and found solace in each other's company. "We did it," Anara said softly, her eyes reflecting the joy and relief of the moment. "We've given them hope." Mark nodded, his arm around her shoulders. "And we've shown them that no matter how dire things seem, we can always find a way to fight back." The days that followed were filled with rebuilding and fortification. With the new influx of survivors, the valley's defenses were strengthened, and new structures were erected to accommodate the growing population. Anara and Mark worked tirelessly, their leadership guiding the community through each challenge. One evening, as they stood on a hill overlooking the valley, Mark turned to Anara, his expression serious yet hopeful. "We've come so far, Anara, but we can't stop here. The enemy is still out there, and we need to keep pushing forward." Anara nodded, her resolve unwavering. "You're right. We need to take the fight to them, to ensure that our future is secure." Their next objective was clear: to gather intelligence and launch a coordinated strike against the enemy's stronghold. It was a dangerous mission, but one that could potentially turn the tide of the war. Anara and Mark spent countless hours planning and preparing, their strategy meticulous and their determination unyielding. As they prepared to embark on their mission, the valley's inhabitants gathered to see them off. There was a palpable sense of anticipation and pride in the air. Anara and Mark addressed the crowd, their voices carrying the weight of their shared purpose. "We fight not just for ourselves, but for the future we're building together," Anara said, her eyes meeting those of the people she had come to care for deeply. "We will return victorious, and we will continue to protect this home we've created." Mark stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. "Stay strong, stay united. We will be back, and we will bring with us the dawn of a new era of peace." With those words, they set out, a small but determined team of fighters by their side. The journey to the enemy stronghold was fraught with danger, but their resolve never wavered. They moved with stealth and precision, avoiding patrols and navigating treacherous terrain. Upon reaching the outskirts of the enemy's base, they set up a covert observation point. The stronghold was heavily fortified, but Anara and Mark had anticipated this. They spent days gathering intelligence, mapping out the layout, and identifying weak points. The night of the assault arrived, and the team moved into position. Anara and Mark led the charge, their actions swift and coordinated. Explosives were planted at strategic locations, and as the first blasts echoed through the night, chaos erupted within the enemy's ranks. The battle that followed was intense and brutal. Anara and Mark fought side by side, their movements synchronized and deadly. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden attack, struggled to mount a defense. The team pressed their advantage, dismantling key installations and crippling the stronghold's defenses. In the heat of the battle, Anara and Mark found themselves face to face with the enemy commander. A fierce fight ensued, their skills and determination pushed to the limit. With a final, decisive strike, they defeated the commander, dealing a significant blow to the enemy forces. As the dust settled, the team regrouped and assessed their victory. The stronghold lay in ruins, its defenses shattered. Anara and Mark exchanged a look of triumph and exhaustion. They had done it. They had struck a critical blow against the enemy, paving the way for a broader push towards peace. Returning to the valley, they were met with jubilation and relief. The inhabitants celebrated their victory, but Anara and Mark knew that this was just the beginning. They addressed the crowd, their voices filled with hope and determination. "We've taken a significant step towards ending this war," Anara said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "But our work is not done. We must remain vigilant and continue to fight for our future." Mark added, "Together, we've shown that we can overcome any obstacle. We will keep pushing forward, and we will build a world where we can all live in peace." The sense of unity and purpose in the valley was stronger than ever. Anara and Mark, their bond now unbreakable, continued to lead with compassion and strength. They knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but they faced it with unwavering resolve. As they stood together, watching the sun rise over the valley, Anara felt a deep sense of peace. They had come so far, and they had so much further to go. But with Mark by her side, she knew they could face any challenge and build a future filled with hope and possibility. The new dawn that broke over the valley was more than just the start of a new day. It was a symbol of the brighter future they were creating together. Anara and Mark, united by their love and their shared vision, were ready to lead their people into a new era of peace and prosperity.